couple years ago, I wrote this essay, "We Need Critical ADHD Studies Now." I was inspired by the work of Dr. G, in particular this piece, and I was also going through a major critical autism studies hyperfixation, and I was like, damn, we need this for ADHD. Critical autism studies is critical, not in the sense that it's denying autism is real. Mostly it's autistic researchers taking a field that has historically been led by doctors and professionals who are looking at autism from the outside, and they're saying, first of all, we would like to have a say here as autistic people, but also, can we think about stuff like gender and race, class and power? It's really hard to find anti-capitalist and also disability-affirming ADHD content for a popular audience, so I've been trying to change that. I write a newsletter. You should subscribe to it. It's called Sluggish. But I'm not an academic. I'm just some guy on the internet with a special interest, so I'm happy to inform you. The researchers are researching. This book chapter came out in late 2024. It's called Introduction to Critical ADHD Studies, and full disclosure, I am in it. Meadows 2021. Hi, hello. And since I like to read PDFs of textbooks for fun, I would love to tell you more. The first question obviously is, why do we need critical ADHD studies? And the answer to that, similar to autism research, is that most of the knowledge we have about ADHD comes from professionals who are not ADHD themselves. The authors split this knowledge into two camps: the pathology approach, which usually frames ADHD as either a chemical imbalance or a disorder of the brain's executive functions. So for example, everything Russell Barkley has ever written. And on the other hand, you have the diagnosis criticals, which view ADHD as over-medicalizing regular problems of life. They often cite a guy named Thomas Zaz, a right-wing libertarian who thought mental illness was a myth that people adopted to get out of their personal responsibilities. There are also diagnosis criticals on the left who claim, for example, that ADHD is entirely a disorder of capitalism.
See, this is how American society treats unique, enthusiastic children. Instead of embracing their mental gifts, their first reaction is to shoot them up with hardcore drugs until they're mindless sheeple. All the better to send off to Kuwait and feed the Halliburton oil machine, right? Bush.
Yep, takes all kinds.
Sort of right, but also sort of wrong. You can recognize a diagnosis critical by how much they talk about overdiagnosing and overprescribing. A good example of this is the book The Medicalization of Society by Peter Conrad. I do have to admit that I went through my own diagnosis critical phase when I first started to grapple with my diagnoses, but I never went full ADHD does not exist, because I know through my experiences it does. There are real things about my body and my brain that are really different and really disabling in our current socio-political context. And diagnosis criticals often fail to engage with that, which means they end up doing a disability denial. We don't want that. According to the authors, the problem with both of these camps is that they tend to, quote, focus on ADHD rather than ADHDers, meaning they overlook our agency, our ability to describe and define our own experiences. Critical ADHD studies is different because it looks to ADHDers for knowledge about ADHD. And specifically, it's a field that questions neuronormativity, quote, a set of norms, standards, expectations, and ideals that center a particular way of functioning as the right way to function. So for example, the assumption that the ability to maintain selective attention for extended periods of time in work or school is a marker of health. Critical ADHD studies asks, where did this assumption come from? Why do we think this? What purpose does it serve? Who benefits? We have questions. For me, a critical study of anything starts with history. What events and conditions shaped this thing we call ADHD and made it what it is now? So my first recommendation is the book Mind Fixers by Anne Harrington. She's a medical historian, and she covers the development of biological psychiatry in the US over the course of the 20th century. I think reading this will help you understand the pathology approach. So much rhetoric that we hear now about ADHD and neurotransmitters and dopamine deficiency has actually been going on for a very long time in regards to other diagnoses like depression and schizophrenia. And I think getting an overview of that history will help you connect a lot of dots. thoughts. For a more specific history, there's ADHD Nation by the journalist Alan Schwartz. This book is actually a good example of the diagnosis critical camp, and I do have my issues with it, but I think Schwartz tells a really good story. He's a talented writer. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here about how the ADHD diagnosis came to be in the US, but he definitely has an angle that leans a bit toward denial. But I think you should read things that you disagree with because it helps you sharpen your own ideas. Now, for a little bit of Marxism as a treat, I would recommend Psychiatric Hegemony by Bruce M.Z. Cohen. The whole book is interesting, but I'm a firm believer that you can just read the introduction and the chapter that interests you and maybe the conclusion, and you get the gist of a nonfiction book that way. You don't have to read every single page. Maybe that's an ADHD opinion. That's what I do most of the time. There's a chapter in here on ADHD and how the education system under capitalism has been developed to produce a certain kind of workforce. Cohen puts mental illness in quotes throughout the book, which I don't really like. It's diagnosis critical adjacent, in my opinion, but the absolute goat of Marxist psychiatry critique is Empire of Normality. Robert Chapman gives a materialist account of why ADHD diagnoses are on the rise without denying it's a real disability. Fantastic work. I interviewed them last year about it, so go listen to that. The most relevant chapter for our critical ADHD studies syllabus is Post-Fordism as a mass disabling event. This is not to say these problems did not exist prior to post-Fordism or that things like autism or ADHD are not real disabilities. They are no less real than diabetes or dementia, but existing forms of difficulty or disablement, while to some extent grounded in atypical neurological development, were in many cases hugely amplified in this phase of capitalism. Traits that were previously relatively benign became associated with some level of disablement, while traits that might have only been minimally disabling became significantly so. This has increased as the intensification of capitalism has become so pervasive, it structures or at least taints almost every aspect of sensory experience and cognitive processing in day-to-day life, whether in work or in leisure time. It is not the technology itself that is the problem, but rather that technology is primarily used in the service of capital and the various systems of domination that capitalism is intertwined with, which leaves so many of us constantly fatigued far beyond the workplace. And this increasingly stifles the development and thriving of even those who diverge in a relatively minimal way from the ever more restrictive cognitive norms of the age. Also, have you read Health Communism yet? You need to read Health Communism. I'm going to keep reminding you to read Health Communism until I die. Okay, so that's a good chunk of readings on the pathology versus diagnosis critical approaches that you will encounter in the wild. There's one more really popular approach though, and this one is a little different because it's usually by ADHDers themselves, but I actually think it tends to be the most capitalized. It's the strengths-based approach. If you've ever heard anyone say that ADHD is their superpower, or if you've suffered through this Paris Hilton song, that's what we're talking about here. And while it is a necessary correction to talk about our strengths when there's so much focus on our deficits, the strengths-based camp tends to overcorrect. And they can end up arguing for their worth as human beings based on their exceptional abilities, which of course is the definition of ableism. Unfortunately. The main text in this camp, in my opinion, is ADHD 2.0 by Ed Hallowell and John Brady. I made a video about this a couple years ago for my paid subscribers. I will link it below. But Hallowell likes to call ADHD an asset and ADHDers natural-born entrepreneurs. He has also said more than once that the settlers who colonized America must have had ADHD genes, and that's what made them so good at colonizing. So you can see how this strengths-based approach goes bad real fast. Another way ADHDers like to talk about ADHD is the difference approach, which is pretty self-explanatory.
We are attention different, not attention deficit.
And these are not distinct approaches. They often mix together. But I think the really interesting stuff is happening in what the authors call the phenomenological and community theorizing approaches to ADHD. Phenomenological means that the research is coming from the researcher's own experience, and community theorizing is what you find outside the academy, in blog posts, on social media, at sluggish.xyz. An example of the phenom approach is this paper. I also interviewed two of the authors about it last year, Hannah and Lil. I will link that in the description if you want to listen to it. Basically, they designed a collective writing process to explore what what ADHD is like for them. And they came up with some other terms that they felt were better descriptors than the ones we commonly use. So instead of hyperactivity, they talked about intensity. Instead of inattention, they talk about variable attention, which actually originally comes from Hallowell and Rady. See how the approaches overlap? They also talk about having inner rhythms that don't fit with the wider rhythms of society, which I thought was a really interesting reframe of what's usually called time blindness, which I fucking hate. That's another video entirely. Don't let me go on a tangent about time blindness. There are a few more readings by ADHD scholars that I would recommend here. The first is this poem by Kedra Bui, which is at the end of their dissertation. It's called Interdisciplinary Studies for Time Deficit Attention Travelers, and it's extremely beautiful. The Italian root of stanza means room, station, stopping place. Here's my loophole, my hack to the doorway effect. I unmake-believe the walls of rooms to pay attention. Since white equals all visible colors, white equals seeing each strand at once. I'm the disorganizer, tossing out space dividers, as star-like neurons bolt skywalks across stanzas of my brain parts. Labyrinths never unravel the same way twice. I shuffle the bridge, nightmares disorder, and fling cards across floors, so I become astrographer of the scattered. Anything I draw, I can make connect. Their dissertation is also kind of meta in the sense that it plays with nonlinearity and structure as a way to put the reader inside their experience of ADHD. In Disability as a Cultural Problem, the philosopher Jonathan Flowers frames ADHD as something that happens in the transaction between biology and culture. It's not purely biological, as the pathologists would claim, or purely cultural, as the diagnosis criticals might say, but a combination of the two that creates a secret third thing. We love a secret third thing. Fergus Murray and Sunny Howlett apply the idea of monotropism to ADHD. This was originally a theory of autism as an attentional difference. Monotropic people tend to focus tunnel, have intense interests, and struggle with task switching. And preliminary research has found that ADHDers can also be pretty monotropic. Okay, and last but not least, Andrew Brown wrote a dissertation about his theory of ADHD that is both critical and affirming. It's called The Univocity of Attention. He writes, neurotypicals like to conceptualize ADHD's attention as equivocal, in the most literal sense of equivocity, equal voices. Our attention is said to be split between a call of many different voices, each sounding equally significant. We have trouble attending to one voice at the expense of all the others. This makes us confused, dazed, and scatterbrained. But what if neurotypicals are mistaken? What if ADHD is grounded in a radically different way of attending to the world? What if our attention is not equivocal at all, but univocal? I do not mean choosing one voice over the others. I mean choosing to hear all the voices as one, a univocity of attention. It's all connected, which makes it hard to express things to people who expect a more ABC understanding of the world. This is probably why so many of us love the Pepe Sylvia meme. Brown argues ADHD individuals are purposeful in their attention. They are not driven by a goal. They are driven to univocity. This can result in completing tasks or achieving one's goals if the drive to univocity aligns with these aims. This is not always easy to do in a world geared toward alienated labor. Productivity under capitalism so often requires that we sever our own desires, including the drive to univocity, from the productive process. I think that's my favorite take on ADHD so far. It's chapter 6. Check it out. Let me know if you want me to elaborate on any of this. I'm always happy to info dump for the class. Check below for links and sources, and also subscribe at sluggish.xyz. That's where I post the most. But my 2025 resolution is to make more videos, because I know that's how people like to chug their information now.